2:15 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. Two B-2 Spirit stealth bombers were already deep inside the monitoring zone, their dark silhouettes invisible against the midnight sky. This was not a standard training mission. For the first time in 3 years, the United States was flying nuclear-capable assets toward the Iranian coastline with their transponders intentionally disabled. The silence in the cockpit was absolute. Major Miller, the mission commander for the lead aircraft, callsign Reaper 11, adjusted his oxygen mask. He spoke into the internal intercom. "Check in. Reaper 12. Are you in position?" The response from his wingman was immediate. "Reaper 12 is 5 miles back. Spacing is perfect. We are clean on all sensors." Miller looked out into the void. Somewhere below, the Iranian coast was approaching at 500 miles per hour. This mission, designated Quiet Thunder, was designed to test a theory that had only lived in simulators until tonight. The question was no longer if the Iranian air defense network would see them, but what would happen to the regional balance of power. If the bombers chose to reveal themselves at the doorstep of the capital, the air at 40,000 feet was thin and freezing. Inside the cockpit, the only sound was the low hum of the environmental control system and the faint click of cooling electronics. The B-2 was a flying wing, a billion-dollar masterpiece of engineering that defied the laws of traditional physics. It did not have a tail. It did not have sharp angles. To an enemy radar, it was supposed to look like a large bird or a small cloud, if it looked like anything at all. 600 miles to the north, at the Air Defense Operations Center in Tehran, the atmosphere was calm. The midnight shift was halfway through their watch. Sergeant Karimi watched his console. He saw the usual cargo ships in the Strait of Hormuz and a few civilian airliners heading toward Dubai. To his eyes, the sky was empty of threats. The sophisticated Russian-made S-300 missile systems were in standby mode. The operators were confident in their digital shield. The bombers reached their first navigational waypoint. They were now within 50 miles of the Iranian mainland. The mission profile called for a sharp turn, a maneuver that would usually trigger every alarm in the region. Miller gripped the controls. He felt the weight of the aircraft as it banked into the dark. He spoke again. "Begin the cycle. Activate the Ghost." In the back of the aircraft, the electronic warfare suite came to life. It did not jam the enemy radar with noise. Instead, it began to feed the Iranian sensors a lie. It was a carefully constructed digital reality, where the sky remained empty, even as two massive bombers moved through it. Miller watched his display. The Iranian radar sites were active. They were sweeping the area where he was currently flying, but the return signals were being intercepted, modified, and sent back as if nothing was there. But the return signals were being intercepted, modified, and sent back as if nothing was there. Below the bombers, the lights of the coastal cities began to flicker through the haze. The pilots were now closer to Iranian soil than any heavy American bomber had been in decades. They were operating in a gray zone of international law and military technology. If the electronic ghost failed, they would be staring at the business end of a surface-to-air missile battery within seconds. The mission was not about destruction. It was about the psychological edge. The Pentagon wanted to know exactly how close they could get before the silence was broken. They were pushing the limits of stealth and electronic deception to their absolute breaking point. Miller checked his fuel state. They had enough for another 30 minutes in the zone, before they had to turn back toward the waiting tankers. Every second spent this close to the coast increased the risk of a technical glitch, or a visual sighting by a lucky patrol boat. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:26 in the morning. The Bandar Abbas sector. Sergeant Karimi leaned forward, his face illuminated by the pale green glow of the radar console. He was a veteran of 5 years in the Air Defense Command. He knew the difference between a flight of birds and a technical malfunction. On his screen, a jagged pulse appeared for less than a second. It was not a solid icon. It was a whisper in the data. He spoke to the officer standing at the central map table. "Captain, I have a momentary return. Bearing 180, 50 miles south of the coast. Captain Rahimi did not look up immediately. He was studying the flight plan of a Turkish cargo plane far to the west. He spoke with a bored tone. "The humidity is rising over the water, Karimi. The Russian systems are sensitive to the temperature inversion. Check your filters." Karimi adjusted the gain on his receiver. The sky should have been empty, the electronic lie being fed to the station by the B-2 bombers was nearly perfect. But even the best algorithms have a margin of error. For a brief moment, the physical shape of Reaper 11 had reflected a single pulse of energy from the coastal array. Karimi spoke again, his voice tighter. "Captain." The return was sharp. It did not drift like weather. It was moving at 400 knots. The captain walked over to the console. He stared at the empty sweep of the radar arm. If something was there, it is gone now. There is no transponder signal. There is no heat signature from the satellites. Thousands of feet above the dark water, Major Miller watched his own displays. The amber light on his electronic warfare panel was pulsing slowly. It was a warning. The bomber had detected the radar energy hitting its skin. Miller spoke into the intercom. "Reaper 1-2. We just took a direct hit from a coastal search radar. Our signature may have peaked. How do your systems look?" The voice of the second pilot came back through the encrypted link. "Reaper 1-2 is still masked, but the ground station is increasing its power. They are suspicious." "Copy that," Miller responded. "We are maintaining the track. Do not deviate. If we turn now, the Doppler shift will make us look like a mountain in the sky." The two bombers continued their silent approach. They were now 45 miles from the coast. This was the transition point. If they continued, they would be entering the inner ring of the Iranian missile defenses. The S-300 batteries were now in a higher state of readiness. The crews on the ground were no longer leaning back in their chairs. Back in the command center, Captain Rahimi was no longer bored. He reached for a dedicated red phone on the table. This line connected directly to the tactical air wing at the nearby airbase. The captain spoke into the receiver. "This is Sector South. We have a non-correlated anomaly. I want eyes in the air." Scrambled the alert birds. "Low altitude intercept. Vector 180. 30 miles away, the quiet of the night was shattered by the roar of twin engines. Two 14 Tomcat interceptors, relics of an older era but maintained with meticulous care, began their taxi. These were the heavy hitters of the Iranian fleet. They carried powerful radars designed to find targets at long range. Inside the cockpit of the lead Tomcat, the pilot call sign Sultan 1 checked his weapon switches. He did not know what he was looking for. He only knew that. The ground controllers sounded nervous. The pilot spoke to his backseat officer. "Can you see anything on the pulse Doppler?" The officer responded. "The screen is clear, but the ground says the ghost is moving fast. We will be in visual range in 10 minutes. Major Miller saw the heat plumes on his infrared sensor. Two fast movers were climbing out of Bandar Abbas. They were heading directly toward the bombers. The game of hide-and-seek was over. The confrontation had begun. Miller spoke to his wingman. "Reaper 1-2. We have interceptors in the air. They are coming to find us. Stay dark. Stay silent." The Iranian jets leveled off at 20,000 feet and accelerated to Mach 0.9. They were hunting in the dark, searching for a shadow that was not supposed to exist. 2:38 in the morning. The edge of the Iranian territorial limit. The two B-2 bombers were now 38 miles from the coast. Inside the cockpit of Reaper 11, the electronic warfare display was becoming a chaotic map of threats. Every major radar site along the southern coast was now radiating at maximum power. The Iranian military was no longer guessing. They knew something was in their sky. Major Miller watched the two Iranian Tomcats on his situational display. They were closing the gap at 12 miles per minute. The 14s were currently 5,000 feet below the bombers, sweeping the horizon with their powerful radar. Miller spoke to his co-pilot. "They are looking for a physical return. But their radar energy is washing right off our skin. As long as we do not give them a side profile, They are blind. The co-pilot checked the defensive systems. Sir, the lead Tomcat is activating its infrared search and track system. They are trying to find our heat signature. Understood, Miller replied. Reduce engine thrust to 60%. Keep the exhaust masked. We need to stay as cold as the surrounding air. In the cockpit of the lead Iranian Tomcat, the pilot, Sultan 1, was struggling. His radar screen was filled with flickering false targets, a side effect of the B-2 electronic countermeasures. The ground controller, in Tehran, was shouting coordinates into his headset, but when he looked at those coordinates, there was nothing but empty black space. The pilot spoke to his radar intercept officer in the back seat. Look for any discrepancy in the stars. If they are stealth, they will still block the light. Anything. Give me anything. The officer responded. I have a faint thermal spike. It is inconsistent, bearing 185. Altitude is high. Maybe 40,000 feet. Sultan 1 pulled back on the stick. The heavy fighter climbed aggressively, its twin engines leaving long trails of fire in the night. I am moving to visual range. If I cannot lock him, I will find him with my eyes. Back at the Air Defense Operations Center, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Captain Rahimi stood over the main tactical table. He saw the icons for his two interceptors merging with the last known location of the intruders. He also saw 3 more batteries of S-300 missiles coming online further inland. The captain turned to his communications officer. Signal the intruders on the International Guard frequency. Tell them they are approaching a restricted zone. Tell them we are prepared to defend our sovereignty. A moment later, the radio in Miller's cockpit crackled to life. Unidentified aircraft. This is the BLA, Iranian Air Defense Command. You are approaching the territorial waters of the Islamic Republic of Iran. You are in violation of international flight protocols. Turn to heading 180 immediately, or you will be intercepted. Miller did not respond. To give the Iranians a point of origin for his location. He remained silent, his hands steady on the controls. He looked at his wingman on the digital link. Reaper 1-2 was holding its position perfectly. They were now only 32 miles from the coast. They were entering the heart of the most defended airspace in the Middle East. Miller spoke to his crew. We are staying on mission. We are not turning yet. We need to see how they react when we cross the 30-mile line. The Iranian Tomcats were now less than 10 miles away. At that distance, even a stealth aircraft can sometimes be seen by a pilot with sharp eyes and a clear canopy. The two sides were on a collision course in the dark. The warning signs were no longer subtle. Both nations were now positioning for a confrontation that neither side could easily walk back. The 14 pilot saw a flicker, a shadow against the stars. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough to confirm his suspicions. Sultan 1 keyed his radio. Command, I have visual confirmation of a large flying wing. It is a B-2. I repeat, it is a B-2 Spirit. I am moving into a firing position, 2:50 in the morning, over the edge of the Iranian territorial limit. The Iranian Tomcat roared into the 6 o'clock position behind the lead bomber. At this range, the massive radar in the nose of the 14 was useless against the stealth coating of the B-2, but the pilot's eyes were not. Sultan 1 pulled his jet within 3 miles of Reaper 1-1. He could see the faint glow of the cockpit lights and the strange, alien shape of the flying wing against the moonless sky. Inside the cockpit of Reaper 1-1, the threat warning receiver emitted a low, rhythmic pulse. It was the sound of a radar searching for a lock but failing to find a solid return. Major Miller's co-pilot checked the rear-facing infrared camera. Sir, he is right on our tail. 2 miles and closing. He is aggressive. He is maneuvering for a gun solution. Miller kept his eyes on the primary flight display. Maintain course. If we maneuver, we increase our radar cross-section. We are still a ghost to the ground batteries. Let him dance. 3,000 miles away, in a windowless room at the National Military Command Center in Virginia, a 4-star general watched the live data feed. The position of the bombers and the interceptors was represented by 2 icons nearly touching. The general spoke to his aide. "What are the current rules of engagement for this mission?" The aide responded quickly. "The pilots are authorized to use defensive measures only. They cannot fire unless fired upon. If the Iranians achieve a weapons lock, the bombers are ordered to bank and exit the zone immediately." The general stared at the screen. 30 miles. They are within 50 kilometers of the primary radar sites. If the Iranians pull the trigger, our crews have no room to breathe. Back in the sky, Sultan 1 was frustrated. His radar intercept officer in the back seat was struggling to get the computer to accept a target that the sensors insisted was not there. The officer spoke through the intercom. "I cannot get a digital lock. The system keeps rejecting the track. I am going to manual. I will try to slave the heat-seeking missiles to the visual sight." Sultan 1 nudged his throttles forward. The 14 drifted closer. He was now less than 1 mile behind the B-2. He could see the individual tiles of the stealth skin. He felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the ultimate prize for any fighter pilot. The Iranian pilot keyed his radio to the ground command. "I am in position. I have the target in my sights. Requesting permission to engage." The response from Tehran was immediate and sharp. "Sultan 1. This is command. You are not cleared to fire. I repeat, you are not cleared to fire. Maintain contact. Force them to turn. If they cross the 12-mile limit, then we will reevaluate." Miller heard the silence on the international frequency. It was more terrifying than the shouting. He knew the Iranian pilot was waiting for a single word to end the standoff. Miller spoke to his wingman. "Reaper 1-2. Prepare for the break. On my command, we are going to use the high-frequency jammers and dive for the deck. But not yet. We give them 5 more miles." The air was thick with unspoken threats. The Iranian Tomcats were now flanking the bombers, 1 on each side. It was an escort mission that looked like an execution. The B-2 bombers were no longer hiding. They were daring the Iranian air defense network to take the first step. The distance to the coast dropped to 28 miles. Every radar site from Bushehr to Bandar Abbas was now locked onto the general area. The sky was no longer empty. It was a cage. 3 o'clock in the morning. 25 miles from the Iranian coast. The standoff had reached a point of maximum physical proximity. Inside the cockpit of Reaper 1-1, the visibility was limited to the instrument panel and the ghostly shape of the Iranian F-14 Tomcat, just 30 feet off the left wingtip. Major Miller could see the Iranian pilot looking directly at him. The distance was so small that any minor atmospheric turbulence could cause a mid-air collision. Miller's co-pilot checked the fuel levels. 20 minutes of loiter time remaining. "Sir, if we do not turn soon, we will be hitting the tankers on fumes." "We are not turning," Miller said. His voice was steady. "We are committed to the track." "How is the second Tomcat behaving?" The co-pilot looked at the right side camera. "Sultan 2 is sitting on Reaper 1-2. They are mirroring us perfectly. It is a formation flight now, but their ground-to-air systems are getting louder." The electronic warfare suite was now screaming. The Iranian S-300 batteries on the mainland had transitioned from search mode to target track. This meant the missile computers were calculating the exact intercept point for a launch. The bombers were being bathed in high-frequency radiation. Inside the Iranian Tomcat, the heat of the cockpit was rising. Sultan 1 felt the sweat beneath his flight suit. His infrared search and track system was finally holding a steady lock. The B-2 bombers were trying to stay cold, but at this close range, the heat of their engines was impossible to hide from a modern sensor. The pilot spoke to his backseat officer. "I have a solid thermal track. If command gives the word, the missiles will not miss." "They are sitting ducks," the officer responded. "Look at their heading. They are not flying toward a military base. They are heading for the gap in the radar coverage near the mountain range." They know the terrain as well as we do. Sultan 1 keyed his radio to Tehran. Command. The intruders are 22 miles from the coast. They are accelerating. I am losing the ability to pace them without using my afterburners. If I use my burners, I will be out of fuel in 10 minutes. The response from the Air Defense Operations Center was no longer hesitant. It was a command. Sultan 1, force them down. You are authorized to perform a barrel roll over their nose. Create a wake vortex. Make it impossible for them to maintain level flight. This was an extremely dangerous maneuver. Assault without the use of weapons. Sultan 1 gripped his control stick. He pulled his heavy fighter up and over the top of the billion-dollar stealth bomber. The massive engines of the Tomcat threw a wall of turbulent air directly into the path of the B-2. Inside Reaper 1-1, the aircraft jolted violently. The flying wing was sensitive to wake turbulence. The autopilot disconnected with a loud chime. Miller grabbed the stick, fighting to keep the wings level. The bomber groaned under the aerodynamic stress. "Control is manual," Miller shouted, resetting the flight computers. "He is trying to knock us out of the sky." His co-pilot was busy toggling switches. "Sir, the Iranian ground stations just went to active fire control. They are one button push away from a launch." The B-2 bombers were now 20 miles from the coast. This was the absolute limit of the mission profile. To go any further would be to invite a full-scale kinetic engagement. Both sides were now fully committed to their positions. The Iranian pilots were flying at the edge of their capability. The American crews were testing the physical limits of their aircraft. Miller looked at his tactical map. The next waypoint was 5 miles ahead. At that point, the bombers were scheduled to release their electronic payload. He spoke into the radio. "Reaper 1-2, hold steady. We are at the door. Do not let them push us off the line." The tension was so thick it was felt in every command center, from Washington to Tehran. The morning air was about to catch fire. 3:0 to 5 in the morning, 20 miles off the Iranian coast. Major Miller reached for the guarded switch on the center console. Reaper 1-1, doors cycling now. The massive composite bay doors of the lead B-2 began to slide open. It took only 4 seconds. But in those 4 seconds, the stealth profile of the aircraft changed. The radar cross-section bloomed. On the ground at Bandar Abbas, the radar screens did not just show a ghost, they showed a mountain. "Target is solid," Sergeant Karimi shouted in the command center. "I have a fire control solution. S-300 Battery 4. Lock is confirmed." Captain Rahimi did not hesitate. The intruders had opened their weapons bays. In the logic of aerial combat, this was the final act before a strike. Authorize Battery 4. Prepare to launch. Sultan 1. Engage with your short-range missiles. Clear the sky. Inside the Iranian Tomcat, the HUD flashed a steady red box. Sultan 1 felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He toggled his weapon selector to the heat-seeking Sidewinder. A high-pitched growl filled his headset. The missile was looking at the engines of the B-2. The pilot spoke. "I have a tone. Launching in 5, 4, 3. Inside the B-2, the cockpit was a symphony of alarms. The threat warning receiver was no longer pulsing. Multiple locks, ground and air. "We are lit up like a Christmas tree, sir. We have to brake." Miller did not move the stick. His eyes were fixed on the timer on his secondary display. "Not yet." "Release the payload. 3, 2, 1, mark." A small, cylindrical object dropped from the bay of Reaper 1-1. It was followed by a second from Reaper 1-2. These were not bombs. They were the experimental SpearX electronic pods. They did not fall toward the ground. Instead, they deployed small wings and began to orbit the bombers. 3:0 to 6 in the morning. The S-300 missile battery on the coast reached its final launch sequence. The solid-fuel rocket motor ignited with a roar that shook the sand. A single interceptor missile tore into the night sky. It was moving at Mach 4. It was slave to the radar return of the lead B-2. "Missile away," Karimi reported. "Time to impact. 15 seconds." Miller watched the digital threat closing the distance. Activate the spear. Now. The electronic pods emitted a concentrated burst of microwave energy. It was a surgical strike against the digital architecture of the Iranian network. Sultan 1 saw his radar screen turn to static. His HUD went blank. The tone in his headset vanished. He pulled the trigger on his missile, but nothing happened. His fire control computer had crashed. "I have lost him," Sultan 1 shouted. "Systems are dark. I am blind." In the command center, every screen went black. The S-300 missile, suddenly deprived of its guidance from the ground, began to tumble. It lost its aerodynamic stability and exploded in a massive fireball 10 miles short of its target. The silence that followed was terrifying. For 60 seconds, the entire air defense sector of southern Iran was paralyzed. No radar, no radio, no data. 3:00 to 7 in the morning. The silence over the Gulf of Oman was heavier than the noise that preceded it. Inside the Iranian Air Defense Operations Center, the crisis was no longer about an intruder. It was about total system failure. The glowing screens that had provided a digital map of the world were now nothing but static and error codes. Captain Rahimi stood in the center of the room, his hands gripped onto the edge of the tactical table. He shouted to his technicians, "Status. I need a status now." A technician frantically rebooted his terminal. The entire southern grid is unresponsive. It is not just the radar. The landlines and the encrypted radio networks are down. We are isolated. 4 miles above the water, Major Miller watched the results of the SpearX deployment. The B-2 was designed to be a ghost, but for the last 60 seconds, it had acted as a black hole. The microwave pulse had done its job with terrifying efficiency. Miller spoke to his co-pilot. "Bay doors are closed. Signature is back to minimum. Let's get out of the kitchen." He began to bank the massive aircraft into a sharp turn toward the south, but as the B-2 turned, a new icon appeared on his long-range passive sensor. It was a high-speed, low-altitude contact moving directly 20% away from the Iranian coastline. It was not a Tomcat. It was not a B-2. It was something else entirely. Miller leaned closer to the display. Reaper 1-2. Do you see that? Bearing 090. Crossing the coast at Mach 2.5. The response from his wingman was hushed. "I see it. It just came out of the blind spot we created." It was sitting on the ground until the radar went dark. In the cockpit of the 14, Sultan 1 was fighting for control. His aircraft had not been physically damaged, but the electronic surge had scrambled his navigation computer. He was flying by the stars, his eyes searching the dark for the American bombers. He saw the flash of the S-300 self-destructing in the distance. He thought he was alone. Then, a shape roared past his cockpit. It was a silver blur that moved with a speed he had never witnessed in a combat aircraft. It left no contrail. It made no sound that reached him over his own engines. It was gone before he could even register its shape. A note before continuing. This is a fictional military scenario, created for narrative and analytical purposes only. 3:00 to 9 in the morning. The Iranian command center began to flicker back to life. Backup systems, shielded from the initial pulse, initiated their boot sequences. As the radar sweeps returned to the screens, the picture they painted was completely different from the one they had seen 2 minutes ago. Captain Rahimi stared at the secondary monitor. The B-2 bombers were clearly visible now, moving rapidly away toward international airspace. But there was a third signature, a jagged line of data moving at a speed that the computer refused to classify. It was already 50 miles past the interceptors and heading into the deep ocean. The captain spoke into the restored radio link. "Sultan 1, did you engage the intruder?" The pilot's voice came back, sounding shaken. "I did not fire. My systems were dead. But something just passed me. It was not the American. It was something else. It was faster than anything I have ever seen." Miller, listening in on the unencrypted emergency frequency, shared a look with his co-pilot. They had come to this coastline to test the Iranian defenses. They had come to show the world that the B-2 could reach the doorstep of any nation undetected. But as he watched the mystery contact vanish from his high-end sensors, Miller realized the mission had changed. They had not just tested the Iranians. They had stumbled into a theater where they were not the only actors. "Control," Miller said, switching to his long-range satellite link. "This is Reaper 1-1. The mission objective is achieved. But we have a non-standard sighting to report. We were not the only ones in that airspace." The morning was no longer a simple standoff between two nations. It had become a puzzle that neither Washington nor Tehran was prepared to solve. 3:15 in the morning. International airspace. The two B-2 bombers were now 40 miles south of the Iranian coast. Their noses pointed toward the open sea and a pre-arranged rendezvous with a KC-46 tanker. Behind them, the Iranian air defense grid was fully restored, but the aggression had vanished. The radar sites were tracking the bombers with a weary, professional distance. The fight had gone out of the sector. The fight had gone out of the sector. Major Miller watched his tactical display. The primary mystery was the silver contact that had streaked past the Iranian interceptors. It was no longer on his sensors. It had simply reached a point in the sky and ceased to exist as a digital entity. Miller spoke to his co-pilot. "Run a diagnostic on the SpearX logs. I want to know if that microwave burst triggered a sensor ghost, or if there was physical mass at those coordinates." The co-pilot tapped at his glass screen. "Sir, the logs show a physical displacement of air. Something was there. It was moving at approximately 3,000 miles per hour. That is not a drone we have in the inventory, and it is certainly not Iranian." "Could it be a technical glitch in the SpearX?" Miller asked. The co-pilot shook his head. "Negative. Reaper 1-2 confirmed the sighting on their passive infrared system. We have two independent sensor captures. Whatever it was, it used our electronic blackout as a curtain to move through the zone." In the Iranian cockpit of Sultan 1, the situation was equally grim. The pilot had leveled his 14 at 15,000 feet. His fuel state was critical. He had less than 5 minutes of flight time. Before he would have to glide back to the runway at Bandar Abbas, the pilot spoke to his command center. "Sultan 1 is bingo fuel. Returning to base." "Command, I need a clarification on the third contact. Was that a friendly test?" The response from Captain Rahimi in Tehran was cold and hesitant. "Sultan 1. There was no friendly test. We are reviewing the satellite data from the Revolutionary Guard. We have nothing on our logs that matches that speed. Do not speak of this on the open channel." In the command center, Rahimi felt a sense of profound unease. The Americans had proven they could blind his nation, but that was a known threat. The B-2 was a weapon he understood. The other thing, the silver blur, was a variable that changed the entire strategic calculus of the region. If the Americans had a new platform capable of Mach 3 at sea level, the current Iranian missile systems were obsolete. If it belonged to a third party, the world was even more dangerous than it had been an hour ago. Rahimi turned to his senior analyst. "I want the trajectory of that third contact plotted against every known satellite orbit. I want to know if it came from the ground or the sky." The analyst looked up from a terminal. "Sir, the initial data suggests it originated from a point near the interior desert, but it did not launch like a rocket. It accelerated horizontally. It was already at speed when it crossed the coast. Thousands of feet above." Miller's B-2 banked gently to meet the refueling boom of the tanker. The physical danger of the mission was over, but the mental weight was just beginning. He looked out of the side window. The stars were bright and uncaring. "Reaper 1-1. Contact." The tanker pilot's voice came through the radio. "You look like you have seen a ghost, Miller. You okay?" Miller watched the fuel flowing into his aircraft. "We are fine, Control. Just a long night in the dark. We are ready to come home." The crisis had moved from the tactical to the analytical. The missiles had stayed in their tubes, but the certainty of both military powers had been shattered. The sky was no longer a place of clear boundaries. 3:30 in the morning, high above the Arabian Sea. The B-2 Spirit, Reaper 1-1, remained tethered to the tanker like a dark parasite. Millions of pounds of fuel moved through the boom, restoring the bomber's reach. Major Miller stared at the refueling nozzle, but his mind was back at the 20-mile line. The electronic blackout had lasted only 60 seconds. But in the world of high-stakes military intelligence, 60 seconds was an eternity. Miller spoke to his wingman over the secure intra-flight link. Reaper 1-2. Did your sensor suite catch the departure of that third contact? I lost the track at 30,000 feet. The second pilot responded immediately. Reaper 1-2 here. We tracked it until it hit the edge of the atmosphere. Miller. It did not slow down. It went straight up. If that was a drone, it has a propulsion system that does not use oxygen. Miller leaned back in his seat as the tanker disconnected. Copy that. We are heading for the barn. Let the analysts back at Whiteman Air Force Base earn their pay on this one. On the ground, in Tehran, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. The immediate threat of an American bombing run had evaporated, but a new, more terrifying reality had taken its place. Captain Rahimi sat in a private office, away from the main radar floor. On the screen in front of him was a freeze frame from a high-altitude surveillance camera located on the coast. The image was grainy and distorted by the electronic pulse. But in the center of the frame, caught in a single millisecond of clarity, was a shape. It was not a flying wing. It was a smooth, polished cylinder, glowing with a faint blue ionization. It was positioned exactly between the American bombers and the Iranian interceptors. A senior colonel from the intelligence ministry stood behind Rahimi. We have analyzed the vibration frequencies recorded by the ground sensors during the event. This object was moving through the air, but it was not creating a sonic boom. It was bypassing the atmosphere. Rahimi rubbed his eyes. The Americans were as surprised as we were. I saw their flight path. They broke their formation when it appeared. They were not expecting a third party. The colonel nodded, which means we are facing a variable that neither side controls. If the Americans have this technology, they would not have used it in such a reckless manner. They would have kept it hidden. This was a disruption. Back in the sky, the B-2 bombers were now hundreds of miles away from the Iranian coast. The Quiet Thunder mission would be logged as a success in official reports. They had reached the target zone. They had successfully tested the SpearX system. They had forced a superior enemy force to hesitate. But inside the cockpit, the victory felt hollow. Miller looked at his mission log. The timestamps were a record of a brush with a total war that was averted not by diplomacy, but by a mystery. Miller's co-pilot checked the satellite communications. Sir, we just received a flash message from Global Strike Command. We are ordered to maintain total radio silence regarding the third contact. All sensor data is to be encrypted and uploaded to a restricted server immediately upon landing. They are burying it, Miller said quietly. Or they are terrified of what they are going to find, the co-pilot replied. Below the bombers, the ocean was a vast, empty sheet of black. The high-tension drama of the last hour was transitioning into a cold, silent investigation. The Iranian government would likely protest the violation of their airspace, but they would say nothing about the missile that failed, or the object that defied physics. Both nations had a vested interest in pretending the sky was still a predictable place. The mystery was no longer about a potential war. It was about who, or what, had decided to end the confrontation before the first drop of blood was spilled. 3:45 in the morning. The edge of the Arabian Sea. The immediate crisis had fully resolved. The two B-2 bombers had crossed the final threshold of the danger zone and were now flying through international airspace at 35,000 feet. There was no celebration in the cockpit. There were no high fives. The two pilots sat in the low light glow of their multifunction displays, their bodies heavy with the physical and mental exhaustion of the last 90 minutes. Major Miller adjusted the trim of the aircraft. Reaper 1-2. Status check. Reaper 1-2 is green across the board, the wingman responded. We are in the clear. Iranian signatures have faded to background levels. They have gone home. Copy that, Miller said. Maintain cruise speed. We are going to take the long way around to avoid any further eyes. Inside the Air Defense Operations Center in Tehran, the shift was changing. The frantic energy of the intercept had been replaced by a heavy, professional silence. The technicians were no longer shouting. They were methodically downloading the data logs from the S-300 batteries and the coastal radar arrays. The missile that had exploded 10 miles short of its target was now being recorded as a technical failure during a scheduled exercise. Captain Rahimi stood at the back of the room, watching his team. He knew that by sunrise, a team of high-ranking officers from the Revolutionary Guard would arrive to take control of the investigation. Every hard drive would be pulled. Every man in this room would be debriefed and sworn to secrecy. The official narrative was already being written. The intruders had been repelled by the strength of the air defense network. No mention would be made of the electronic blackout or the silver blur. The captain walked to a window and looked out at the lights of Tehran in the distance. He thought about the pilot, Sultan 1. The man had come within seconds of firing a missile that would have started a global conflict. He had been stopped not by a command, but by a power that made his fighter jet look like a toy. Rahimi spoke to himself, his voice a whisper. We were lucky tonight, both of us. Back on the B-2, the co-pilot was reviewing the final mission metrics. Sir, Strategic Command is requesting a confirmation of the Quiet Thunder objectives. They want a yes or no on the penetration of the inner ring. Miller looked at the map. They had stood on the doorstep of Tehran. They had proven that the billion-dollar investment in stealth and electronic warfare worked, but the success felt tainted. Tell them the objectives were met, Miller said. The Iranian network was successfully compromised at 20 miles. The SpearX system is fully operational, but add a footnote. Mention that the tactical environment is no longer stable. How do you want me to phrase it, sir? The co-pilot asked. Just say the airspace is crowded, Miller replied. They will know what it means. The two bombers moved through the night like shadows, returning to a world that didn't know they existed. The crisis was over. The immediate threat of kinetic war had evaporated into a cold sweat. There would be no headlines about this encounter. There would be no footage on the evening news. The two greatest military powers in the region would continue their dance, but the music had changed. The morning was becoming a reality in the east, a thin line of gray on the horizon. The bombers were alone in the sky, heading toward a home that felt further away than it had 2 hours ago. 5 hours later, the secure briefing room at Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri. The sun was just beginning to touch the rolling hills of the American Midwest, but inside the windowless vault, it was still midnight. Major Miller and his co-pilot sat across from a panel of 5 officers in civilian clothes. There were no rank insignias on the table. There were no recorders, only a single encrypted laptop and a stack of printed sensor logs. A man with graying hair and a neutral expression tapped a pen against the table. Major, let's go over the 30 to 6 timestamp again. Specifically, the activation of the SpearX pod. Miller cleared his throat. His voice was raspy from the long flight. We initiated the pulse at exactly 20 miles from the coast. The objective was to create a total sensor vacuum to allow for a simulated strike on the Bandar Abbas command center. It worked. The Iranian S-300 missile lost its track immediately. And the third contact? The man asked. It appeared during the blackout, Miller said. It was moving from north to south, crossing our path at a 90-degree angle. It originated from within the Iranian border, but showed no signs of standard propulsion. It reached Mach 3 in under 4 seconds. The gray-haired man turned the laptop around. He showed a processed image from the bomber's underside camera. The silver cylinder was visible, blurred by speed but unmistakable in its geometry. We have received the preliminary analysis from the satellite groups, the man said. The Iranians are currently scouring their own desert for a crash site they will never find. They think it was ours. They think we have a hypersonic platform that can ignore their physics. Miller looked at the image. Is it ours, sir? The man didn't answer. He closed the laptop. The mission will be classified as a high-altitude atmospheric phenomenon test. The official record will show that the B-2 bombers encountered severe weather-related sensor interference. The standoff with the Iranian interceptors will be omitted from the public debrief. Miller leaned back. "They fired at us, sir. They scrambled their entire southern wing. We almost started a war, but you didn't," the man replied. "And because you didn't, we now have 60 seconds of high-fidelity data on a propulsion system that shouldn't exist." This was the most successful intelligence-gathering mission in the history of the B-2 program. 6,000 miles away, in a basement office in Tehran, Captain Rahimi was undergoing a similar experience. He sat before a panel of 3 Revolutionary Guard commanders. They did not look at him with respect. They looked at him with suspicion. "You allowed the Americans to reach 20 miles, the lead commander said, "and then you lost your primary radar grid." "The Americans used a new form of electronic warfare," Rahimi explained. "It was a directed energy pulse, but that is not the primary concern. The object that passed the Sultan flight. The object does not exist," the commander interrupted. "It was a digital hallucination caused by the American jammer. Our scientists have confirmed that no physical craft can move at those speeds without a thermal signature." Rahimi knew it was a lie. He had seen the visual logs. He had heard the fear in the pilot's voice. But he also understood the game. To admit the object was real was to admit that Iran's defenses were not just vulnerable to the Americans, but irrelevant to someone else. "I understand," Rahimi said. "It was a hallucination." The tactical aftermath was a series of closed doors and deleted files. In both Missouri and Tehran, the truth was being polished until it was unrecognizable. The strategic reality had shifted. A new variable had been introduced to the chessboard, and neither side wanted to be the first to admit they didn't know how the piece moved. 3 days later, the Pentagon and the Supreme National Security Council in Tehran. The strategic assessment was now complete. In the high-level offices of Washington and the secure bunkers of Tehran, the same data had been sliced into 1,000 different conclusions. The incident that the world would never hear about the night the B-2 bombers stood on the edge of the Iranian coast had become a foundational shift in modern military thought. A quiet message had been passed through the Swiss embassy, the standard channel for backdoor diplomacy between the two nations. It was not a threat, it was a request for clarification. Both sides wanted to know if the other had seen what they had seen. Both sides received the same answer: nothing happened. Strategic experts would later agree that this was the most dangerous moment of the decade. Modern warfare is a game of visible boundaries and understood capabilities. When those boundaries are crossed and those capabilities are eclipsed by something unknown, the primary instinct of a superpower is not to fight, but to reassess. The B-2 mission, Quiet Thunder, had intended to demonstrate that American stealth was total. It had succeeded, but it had also revealed a deeper truth. No matter how advanced the weapon, the human element remains. The final failsafe. Major Miller and Sultan I had looked into the abyss and, for a few seconds, had seen something that made their national animosity seem small. Inside the quiet of his home in Missouri, Major Miller sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the plains. He was officially on leave, a standard procedure after a high-stress mission. He looked at the sky, no longer seeing it as a tactical theater or a grid of coordinates. He saw it as a vast, empty space that held secrets his billion-dollar aircraft couldn't touch. He thought about the silver cylinder. He thought about how it had moved through the blackout without effort, as if the most advanced air defense network on the planet was nothing more than a curtain of smoke. He knew that somewhere in a laboratory or a hidden hangar, people were already trying to reverse engineer the 60 seconds of data he had brought back. They would try to turn the mystery into a weapon. In Tehran, Captain Rahimi was no longer in charge of the southern sector. He had been reassigned to an administrative post in the north, a quiet demotion for a man who knew too much. He sat in a small cafe, drinking tea and reading a newspaper that spoke of routine diplomatic tensions and economic shifts. There was no mention of the fireball over the Gulf or the ghosts in the radar. He understood now that the mission hadn't been about a strike. It had been a demonstration of total invisibility, not just of the bombers, but of the truth itself. The most powerful weapons in the world were not the missiles or the stealth jets. They were the stories that nations told themselves to maintain the illusion of control. Final thought. Modern conflict is often described as a series of calculated moves on a board. But on that night, the board itself had been tilted. The incident proved that the most advanced technology can still be humbled by the unexpected. No missiles flew, no ships were lost. But history had shifted in the dark. Both nations learned that when the line is crossed, restraint is the only thing that prevents the end of everything. Modern warfare is decided not by who fires first, but by who chooses not to fire at all. And in the silence of the Gulf of Oman, both sides had made the same choice. The sky returned to blue, but for those who were there, nothing would ever feel normal again. They had seen the vanishing point, the place where technology and human will meet the unknown. And whatever was watching from the silver blur was not finished with them yet.